Soos genoem gesels ek met Justin Chadwick. Hy is die uitvoerende hoof van die Sitruskwekers-vereniging van Suid-Afrika. Justin, welcome and thank you for joining me.
Morning, Meer. Thank you for the opportunity.
It's really lovely. I think this is a very important matter to talk about. To start with, what is the latest regarding the citrus exports of South Africa?
Yeah, so the latest is, unfortunately, we have a number of containers that are actually stuck at EU borders. In other words, those consignments are not being cleared to enter the EU. And that's obviously causing a lot of problems for our exporters. Firstly, that fruit that stays in those containers attracts demurrage costs. Secondly, they aren't meeting their programs in the different retailers, etc. And thirdly, the fruit is all getting older and therefore there could be quality issues. So that's our immediate issue, is to try and get those containers cleared so that they can enter the EU market.
Can you give me a bit of background? I mean, what led up to this situation? What is going on?
Yeah, it's quite complex and probably a little bit technical, but I'll try and explain it. So we have a pest in South Africa called false codling moth. It's actually an African, some people call it the African moth. It's only found on the African continent. It's never been into any other part of the world. So we do have this pest, and the EU does not have the pest. And 4 years ago, they proclaimed that pest as a regulated pest, which means that all countries that have that pest associated with any of their products, they have to prove that the mitigation treatments that ensure that moth doesn't travel with the fruit or the product into the EU. So South Africa developed a false codling moth management system, what we call the FMS.
Yeah.
It's been heralded around the world as the leading system that people have ever seen. And one of the reasons for that is that it targets the risk in terms of the fruit. So it identifies fruit in different risk categories, and obviously the higher the risk, the elements in that system then change and are more severe. In fact, from the beginning of this year, it became clear that domestic interests in the EU were pressurizing Brussels and the European Commission to actually relook at the FMS and actually bring in additional measures, which in our view and in the view of most experts in the field are totally unnecessary, unjustified, and they've got no technical basis.
I read in your newsletter, I think it's the weekly newsletter, that you mentioned political interference, and you've got quite a strong view about this. Can you elaborate for me a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So obviously we recognize the right of any country to protect their domestic industries. I mean, we have the same thing in South Africa. We've got all sorts of pressure from new pests and diseases coming down from the north, and we'd hate any of those to get into our country. So we recognize that, and we agree with that. But where we have a problem is where it's not scientifically based. And where politics interfere and push through new measures or changes to measures that are not technically justified. So in the case of false codling moth, from very early this year, and in fact for the last number of years, the Spanish citrus industry has been pushing Brussels and the European Commission to bring about cold treatment on all of our fruit, a blanket cold treatment. So that's what the problem is. We do have some cold treatment, different levels of cold treatment depending on the risk in our FMS. But what they demanded was a blanket cold treatment, harsh cold treatment, pre-cooling, etc., across all fruit. And that's obviously a big change, brings about additional costs, wastes a lot of energy. So we're talking about the green situation. It also precludes organics, which we're trying to promote in the industry. And as I said earlier, is totally unnecessary. So the European Commission at the Standing Committee on Plants, Animals, Feed and Food realized that in fact their measures were technically flawed. and in fact withdrew them, which obviously frustrated the Spanish, who then flew off to Brussels and forced them to pass the measures through the next day, even though there were so many problems with the new measures. So, that's why we say that it's purely politically motivated, and that's why we've called upon the South African government to get involved as well, because on the technical side, everything is clear.
When we look at the practical implications regarding the cooling process now, just break it down for me. I mean, I read that it's up to 25 days. I mean, practically, that puts a spanner in the whole process. Do you agree?
Yeah. So there are two aspects to the cold treatment. The one is the pulp temperature. So before you load the container, you have to bring the temperature of the pulp of the fruit down to 5 degrees. Now that's problematic as it is, because you need the cold stores to have the right technology to do that. From next year, that decreases to pulp temperature of 2 degrees, which is impossible. You then have to bring in what's called forced air cooling. And there just simply is not the infrastructure to do that for the volumes that we send into the EU. And then, as you mentioned, the shipping itself is 25 days at 2 degrees.
Yeah.
And that's really problematic, particularly for fruit that goes out of Cape Town port, where the sail time to the EU is a lot less than 25 days. So now you either have to cool it before you load it, and so there's all sorts of hassles with that, or you have to cool it on arrival, and then obviously there's a whole lot of costs attached to that. So both those requirements mean huge big financial implications, but also bring about problems in terms of fruit quality, and that some of the fruit will find difficult to be 25 days at 2 degrees.
And what I'm also thinking now is, in South Africa, we've got an element called load shedding that obviously also plays a role. Do you think that's the truth? I mean, does it play a role?
Absolutely. So I mean, I know you live up in the north, but here in Durban, we haven't had load shedding since the floods in April, because we were given some reprieve because the floods destroyed some of the electricity infrastructure, and so that we haven't had load shedding. So the Durban port's been exempt from load shedding, but I understand it's starting from quite soon. I thought it was meant to be the 1st of August, but so far we've been lucky. But definitely the other ports, Cape Town and Port Elizabeth, if you've got load shedding, unless the cold stores have got some sort of backup generators or some other way of keeping the fruit cool, you have to cool that fruit down to the 5 degrees. And that's one of our big issues that we've raised with the EU, is they're pushing through a thing called the Green Deal, which is meant to improve the environmental conditions under which you export fruit. So for example, the use of energy and waste, and yet these new regulations that they're bringing in actually make it impossible for us to meet some of those Green Deal requirements.
If we look at the citrus industry in South Africa, break it down for me. How big of a role does it play for the local economy?
It's a huge industry. It's the second biggest export in the world. We export about 2.5 million tons. If you look at those 15 kilogram boxes of fruit, it's about 170 million boxes of fruit. Yeah. So it's a massive industry. We employ about 140,000 people on farms and in pack houses, and it brings in an annual revenue to the fiscus of between 25 billion and 30 billion rand per annum. So, and I think the other really important thing about its role in the economy, etc., is that if you drive around the citrus growing regions, many small towns like Kirkwood, Addo, Potensi, Letsiteli, the whole economy of those towns is dependent upon the citrus industry that surrounds them. The accountant, the doctors, the restaurants.
Everything.
yeah, so it's a big player in the rural economy.
Has government replied or reacted in any regard at the moment?
Yeah, so there are two aspects to that. One is the operational side, and we're working very closely with Department of Agriculture to try and release the 1,200 containers that are presently sitting at those borders, and we have nightly meetings with members of Department of Agriculture. So great assistance from them, and we really appreciate that. We've also seen that Department of Trade and Industry have filed for a consultation with the WTO around this issue, which is also a massive step by government. You know, this is the first time South Africa has ever filed for a WTO dispute. Yeah. So it's a big step, and you know, not one that government takes easily, because it impacts on all their relationships with the EU around other issues. So we're really appreciative of that. Where we need urgent assistance is to get the EU to relook at the implementation date. If one looks at the measure, it talks about the measure coming into force 3 days after publication. In other words, publication was 21st of June. In other words, the 24th of June. But then it says the implementation date is the 14th of July. So our Department of Agriculture interpreted that as being new phytosanitary certificates from the 14th of July had to comply with the new measure. Yeah. That gave us 21 days to bring about all the changes necessary. And in fact, the WTO requires 6 months. So 21 days was probably pretty much very difficult and not impossible.
Yes.
But then the EU come back and said, no, the 3 days was the implementation date, and all phytosanitary certificates from the 24th of June actually had to comply. And so we got this, what we call the floating consignment, the consignments, these 1,200 containers that are now stuck. And what we need, we desperately need government to get the EU to interpret their own regulations in the same way that Department of Agriculture did, and accept all phytosanitary certificates before the 14th of July under the old measures as being acceptable, and clear them. That is the only solution to the debacle that's facing us now, and the 600 plus million rands worth of fruit that's caught up in this mess.
I actually can't believe the words are almost coming out of your mouth. It is shocking. I am not a doom prophet, but what would happen to these, you know, you say the fruit that are stuck? I mean, is there a way of bringing it back, or using it in the country, in South Africa? What's going to happen to it if it doesn't get shipped?
So the exporters will have to make some seriously important decisions. We're hoping that most of it will be cleared. You know, a lot of it is compliant. So as I said, the Department of Agriculture is working with their counterparts in Europe to clear most of it. But there will be some that's left behind. And you must remember that each container of fruit is about 350,000 rands worth.
Wow.
So, you know, just losing one container is bad enough.
It is.
100 is a disaster.
It is.
So some of them will divert that fruit. In other words, they'll send that container to a market out of sight of the European Union bloc.
Yeah.
But some of that fruit's already been offloaded into bonded warehouses, so that's not so easy. Unfortunately, given the time that it's taken, etc., some of it might be destroyed. So that's really...
It's it's sad news. And Justin, thank you for the work that you guys are doing. Good luck, and please keep me updated.
Thanks, Mia, and thanks for the opportunity to share with your viewers. Thank you.
Dit was dan Justin Chadwick en hy is uitvoerende hoof van die Sitruskwekersvereniging.